A black boy helps a millionaire change a flat tire. The next day, a black SUV shows up at his door. Lucas couldn't believe his eyes. A shiny black SUV pulled up right in front of his house. The door swung open, and out stepped none other than the man from yesterday, Millionaire David. Curious neighbors peeked from their windows. Lucas's mother rushed outside, her face filled with confusion. "What's going on?" she asked, clearly worried about the unexpected visit from such a powerful man. Lucas was just as stunned. He had simply helped a stranger change a tire the day before, not expecting anything in return. But now the millionaire was standing in front of him, his gaze determined, holding an envelope thick with something. "I couldn't just let things end there," David said. "You helped me without expecting anything, but I can't leave without doing something for you." The air went still for a moment. Everyone held their breath in anticipation. Lucas could feel his heart pounding. What had he done to make someone like David come back to find him? And what did the appearance of this black SUV mean? This story will surprise you with what happens next. Hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell now so you don't miss more emotional and meaningful stories like this one. The sun hung high in the sky, casting a harsh, searing light over a sweltering afternoon. The heat felt like it could burn everything in its path, filling the empty road that stretched endlessly between dry, barren fields. The air was stifling, waves of heat rising from the asphalt creating shimmering ripples that looked like an illusion. David sat behind the wheel of his luxurious SUV, his face showing clear signs of tension. He glanced at his watch and quickly checked his phone. With less than an hour until an important meeting, he had no time to waste. Everything in his life usually ran smoothly, with no room for unexpected disruptions. But just as he pressed the gas to navigate a winding stretch of road, a sharp, jarring sound erupted, a loud pop, causing the car to wobble. The SUV shook violently for a moment before David could control it and steer it to the side of the road. A strange silence fell over the moment, broken only by the sound of the wind whistling through the trees along the roadside. His heart raced as he sensed something was wrong. Taking a deep breath, he opened the door and stepped out. The heat from the asphalt immediately hitting his face made him frown in discomfort. Looking down at the front tire, he cursed under his breath. It was completely flat, the rubber on one side torn open, no longer capable of moving. This was insane. He'd driven hundreds of times, never encountering anything like this. David immediately pulled out his phone, quickly scrolling to call roadside assistance. But when he looked at the top corner of the screen, he froze. No signal. There was no reception whatsoever. He tried moving around the car, holding the phone high, hoping to catch even a slight signal, but to no avail. His face darkened. A wave of frustration surged within him as he realized he was stuck here, unable to contact anyone. This was a nearly deserted area, with no stores or gas stations in sight. The highway was miles away, which meant if no one passed by, he could be stuck here for hours. He leaned against the car, trying to stay calm. The heat made his expensive shirt stick to his back, sweat starting to bead on his forehead. He looked around, scanning the endless road. Not a single car in sight. Why was this happening now? He should have taken the main road instead of this shortcut, but in an effort to save time, he'd opted for the quieter, less traveled route. A bad choice. The more he thought about it, the more frustrated he became with himself. David turned back to the car, his gaze drifting over the trunk. He knew he had a spare tire, but the problem was, he'd never changed a tire in his life. Things like this were always handled by someone else, his assistant, a driver, or roadside services. But now there was no one, just him, the broken car, and a deserted road with no sign of life. A sense of helplessness washed over him. This was the first time in a long while that he felt completely out of control, and he hated it. He sighed, resting his hand on his hip, and looked up at the glaring sky. He wondered whether he should wait longer. Maybe a car would pass by, but for how long? Half an hour, or the entire afternoon. The thought only made him more irritated. He kicked the flat tire lightly, then frowned. He needed a solution. But just as he was lost in thought, he suddenly heard footsteps. The sound was faint but distinct. It came from further down the road, steady and unhurried. Someone was walking toward him. David looked up, squinting against the harsh sunlight. A small figure appeared at the end of the road. The scorching heat of the afternoon made everything in the distance blur, but he could tell it was a person, or rather, a child. An odd feeling crept over David. What was this child doing here in such a remote place? Could he help him, or was this just another cruel twist of fate, sending him a helpless witness to his predicament? David stood still, watching as the small figure came closer. Within him, the initial frustration began to shift into something else, a strange curiosity. David leaned against the car, trying to summon some patience as the afternoon sun continued to scorch the road. Sweat streamed down his forehead, and his expensive shirt was sticking to his back. Just as he was about to climb into the car to turn on the air conditioning, he heard a soft sound, the steady rhythm of footsteps on the asphalt. He lifted his head, squinting against the bright sunlight. In the distance, a boy was walking toward him. The boy appeared to be about 14 years old, small in stature but quick on his feet. His faded t-shirt, worn-out jeans, and sneakers with scuffed soles indicated that he wasn't from a wealthy background. But what caught David's attention most was the boy's eyes, calm, bright, and completely unwavering as they met his gaze. He didn't run up out of curiosity or fear, but walked toward him with a strange naturalness, as if this were the most ordinary thing. Lucas stopped just a few steps away from David, glancing briefly at the luxury SUV before turning his attention back to the man, his face etched with frustration. "Is something wrong, sir?" he asked, his tone calm and unbothered. David was caught off guard by the boy's directness. He looked down at the flat tire, then back at Lucas, unsure of how to respond. "The tire's flat," he said, trying to remain composed. "There's no phone signal. No one's passing by." Lucas nodded and glanced down at the tire. "Do you have a spare tire?" he asked. His question was simple, but delivered in a way that made David pause. The boy didn't seem pitying or curious. He simply asked as though he knew there was a solution. "Yes," David replied slowly, "but I've never changed a tire." He hadn't intended to admit that, but for some reason, in front of this boy, he didn't want to lie. Lucas didn't seem surprised. He nodded again, then said, "I can help you." David stared at the boy, a mixture of skepticism and curiosity filling him. Could a 14-year-old really change a tire? Part of him didn't believe it. Up until now, such tasks had always been handled by his staff or drivers. But here, on an empty road with no one else around, his only option was to trust the boy's word. "Are you sure?" he asked, trying to find any sign of hesitation. But Lucas simply shrugged, his eyes still gleaming with an unwavering certainty. "I've done it many times," he said. "My dad taught me how to change tires when I was 10. David sighed, glancing at his watch. He no longer had the time to argue. "All right," he said, gesturing toward the trunk. "If you think you can do it, give it a try." Without hesitation, Lucas walked over to the back of the SUV and opened the trunk. With practiced ease, he found the toolkit and spare tire, pulling them out without needing any assistance from David. His movements were quick, confident, and without doubt. David crossed his arms, stepping aside to watch. This boy really knew what he was doing. Lucas knelt beside the flat tire and positioned the jack with precision. The sound of metal scraping against metal echoed as he turned the crank, slowly raising the car off the ground. He didn't seem flustered or unsure, just focused and steady. One by one, the bolts came off easily, and within minutes, the flat tire was removed. David watched in silence, trying not to let his surprise show. This boy was way more capable than he'd expected. In less than 10 minutes, Lucas had replaced the tire, tightened the bolts, lowered the car, and double-checked everything to ensure it was stable. As he stood up and dusted his hands off, David was still unsure of how to respond. "Thank you." David finally spoke, though his doubt lingered. "Where did you learn to do this?" Lucas smiled lightly. "My dad's a mechanic. He taught me when I was little." David nodded, but inside, he was still puzzled. A child doing this so effortlessly and expecting nothing in return? Something didn't add up. In David's world, everything ran on a give-and-take principle. No one helped others without a reason. But if that's the case, why would this boy help him? David stood there, watching the boy with a mix of surprise and curiosity. Not only did the boy know how to change the tire, but he did so with skill and speed, faster than any mechanic David had ever seen. The irritation from the initial breakdown had dissipated, replaced by an admiration he didn't want to admit. After a few seconds of silence, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded bill. "Here, you've done me a big favor." "I really appreciate it," David said, extending the money toward Lucas. This was his natural response. Everything in life had a price. If someone did something good, they deserved to be compensated. That's how the world worked, at least in David's world. But Lucas didn't reach for it. The boy took a step back, shaking his head immediately. "I don't need the money. I just wanted to help," he said. David blinked, unsure of what he just heard. "What did you say?" he asked, now with a bit of confusion. "I just wanted to help." Lucas shrugged, his face completely at ease. "You had a problem. I knew how to fix it, so I did it. It's no big deal." David stood still, the bill still in his hand, but it suddenly felt strangely heavy. A poor boy with worn clothes, clearly not well off, yet refusing money so firmly? This went completely against everything David had ever known. In his world, no one did anything without a reason. Everything was a transaction. Even the wealthy did charity to boost their reputation or gain tax benefits. But this boy, he simply helped without expecting anything in return. David studied Lucas more closely. There was no sign that the boy was pretending or testing him. He spoke so naturally, as though it was completely normal. But to David, this made no sense. He was a man who had spent his entire life building a career, knowing all the tricks and calculations of business. He had seen every type of person, those who fawned for personal gain, those willing to do anything for an opportunity. But he had never encountered anyone like Lucas. David lowered his hand, still unsure how to respond. "No one does anything for free." He finally spoke, his tone low and somewhat skeptical. "Everyone wants something in return." Lucas chuckled, a light smile, but there was a hint of challenge in his expression. "You think so?" he asked. "My dad always taught me that if you can help someone, you should. You don't need anything back." David stared at the boy, as if trying to figure out what he was hiding. But Lucas's gaze remained clear, without a trace of deceit or calculation. This was the first twist that left David completely stunned. The silence stretched between them. Finally, David could only put the bill back into his wallet, feeling an unfamiliar sensation stir within him. He wasn't used to someone rejecting his money, but more importantly, he wasn't used to being so completely thrown off by a 14-year-old boy. Lucas smiled softly, then waved. "I have to go now? Take care, sir." David still couldn't find the words, just standing there watching as the small figure disappeared into the distance, the long road stretching out beneath the setting sun. And for the first time in many years, David felt like he didn't understand the world as clearly as he once thought. David drove home, but his mind couldn't focus on the road ahead. The image of Lucas kept swirling in his thoughts. Those bright eyes, the calm demeanor, and especially the way he had turned down money without a second thought. It went against everything he knew about the world. No one does something without expecting something in return. But Lucas was different. The boy seemed to need no reward for his actions, as if kindness was something natural, something without reason. This made no sense to David. The SUV glided through the automatic gates of the estate, the soft glow of the setting sun reflecting off the polished paint. He turned off the engine but remained seated for a moment, his fingers subconsciously tapping lightly on the steering wheel. Over the course of his career, he had met countless people, all with their own motivations, whether overt or hidden. But Lucas, he seemed to have no ulterior motives. David tried to come up with a reasonable explanation, but the more he thought, the more everything seemed nonsensical. Finally, he sighed, opened the car door, and walked inside. Clara, his wife, was in the kitchen, gently stirring a cup of coffee as their two children, Ellie and Josh, chatted animatedly at the dining table. The warmth of the house was the same as every other evening, but David felt like an outsider. He placed his keys on the kitchen counter, poured himself a glass of water, and silently sat down at the table. Clara glanced at him, instantly noticing that something was off. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft but concerned. "You look like you've had a long day." David slowly swirled the glass of water in his hands, debating whether or not to mention what had happened that afternoon. He wasn't the type to easily share what was on his mind, but this time, something felt different. "It's just a strange thing," he said, his voice hesitant. "I met a boy. He helped me change a tire on the side of the road." Clara raised an eyebrow. "A boy?" David nodded. "Yeah. What's strange is, he refused to take money." Clara set her coffee cup down, her eyes flickering with surprise. "Refused money?" Josh, their son, who was eating his dinner, laughed. Was he stupid? Who works without getting paid? David didn't respond immediately. He stared at the glass of water in front of him, trying to make sense of his feelings. I thought the same thing. But the boy, he didn't hesitate. It was like helping without expecting anything in return was the most normal thing in the world. Clara looked at him for a long moment before laughing softly. Maybe he's just a good kid. Not everyone does things for a benefit, David. David lifted his gaze, his eyes sharpening. Everyone wants something, Clara. That's how the world works. The room fell silent. Clara studied her husband, a thoughtful expression crossing her face. Maybe not everyone is like you think, David, she said quietly. Sometimes people help just because they can. David remained silent. Her words should have been easy to dismiss, but they stuck with him, just like the image of Lucas. An unsettling feeling crept into his chest, the sense that maybe he had missed something important. And whether he liked it or not, he knew that this story wasn't going to end so simply. Dinner unfolded in an unusually tense silence. The clinking of knives and forks against ceramic plates echoed through the large dining room, but no one spoke much. Clara noticed that something was off with David. He was usually a man who kept his thoughts to himself, but tonight his silence had a different feel, deeper, more preoccupied. He hadn't touched the steak on his plate, only absent-mindedly stirring the water in front of him as if it was the only thing that held his attention. Clara set her fork down and propped her elbows on the table, gazing intently at her husband. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice soft but clear. "You look different tonight." David looked up, meeting her gaze for a moment before glancing over at their two children, Ellie and Josh. Both were absorbed in their phones, almost oblivious to the conversation between their parents. He hesitated, but eventually decided to share. "Today, I met a boy," he began, his voice slightly hoarse. "My tire blew out in the middle of the road. No phone signal. Then this boy appeared." Ellie, the more sensitive and curious of the two, immediately looked up from her phone. "A boy? How old was he?" David took a sip of water before answering. "About 14. Josh, their 18-year-old son, snorted dismissively. "So what? Did he help you call for roadside assistance?" David shook his head. "No. He changed the tire for me." Ellie's eyes widened in surprise. A 14-year-old boy? He really knew how to do that? Josh didn't seem impressed. He smirked, leaning back in his chair with a casual air. "What's so strange about it? If he's poor, he probably has to know how to do things like that. That's just how they live." David shot a glance at his son. There was something in Josh's tone that bothered him, but he said nothing for the moment. Ellie frowned at her brother. "You're acting like all poor people have to know how to fix cars." Josh shrugged, grabbing his glass of water and speaking with a smug tone. "I'm just telling the truth. When you're poor, you have to take care of yourself. Unlike us, they don't have a choice." He turned to look at David. "But I'm guessing he didn't do it for free, right? You paid him, didn't you?" David looked down at his plate, his fingers lightly tapping the surface of the table. "I offered him money," he said slowly, "but he refused." Clara froze. Ellie's eyes widened in disbelief, and Josh burst out laughing. "He refused money?" David nodded. He could still clearly recall the moment Lucas shook his head, his expression completely indifferent, as if rejecting the money was the most ordinary thing in the world. The boy's words echoed in his mind. "I don't need money. I just want to help." Josh shook his head, still in disbelief. "You're kidding, right? Who turns down money? If I were him, I'd take it right away. I mean, if you're helping someone, why wouldn't you take something that's rightfully yours?" David stared at his son for a long moment. Josh was smart, but his practicality and selfish streak were glaring. He had grown up in wealth, taught that money could solve everything. In Josh's world, kindness always came with a reward, and no one did anything without expecting something in return. Ellie seemed more thoughtful. "Maybe the boy's just a good person," she said slowly. "Not everyone does things for money." Josh snickered derisively. "You think so? He probably didn't take the money because he's too naive. Or maybe he's afraid of being seen as greedy." Clara frowned. "Josh, can't you believe that there are people who do good just because they can?" Josh looked at his mother, shaking his head firmly. "No, the world doesn't work like that. Everyone wants something in return. Even if they don't take the money, they expect some kind of reward, maybe respect, gratitude, or some benefit later." David didn't say anything, but Josh's words stirred something deep within him because part of him agreed with it. His whole life, He had believed that everything had a price. He had met hundreds of people, each with their own motives. Even wealthy philanthropists donated for their reputation, tax benefits, or simply to build a good image. No one did anything without expecting something in return. But Lucas was different. The boy didn't seem like he was waiting for gratitude or trying to impress anyone. He just did what he did and left, as if helping others was completely natural. This left David feeling more confused than ever. Clara looked at David, recognizing the turmoil in his eyes. "Maybe you should look at this from another perspective, David," she said softly. "Not everyone is like you think. Not everyone helps because they expect something in return." David looked up at his wife. He wanted to dismiss her immediately. He wanted to say that it wasn't realistic, that the world didn't operate on simple kindness. But he couldn't, because deep down, he knew Clara might be right. This feeling unsettled him. If Clara was right, if Lucas truly helped without expecting anything in return, then it meant that for all this time, David had been viewing the world through a completely different lens. And that was something he wasn't ready to confront. Suddenly, he didn't want to sit there anymore. He didn't want to continue this conversation for another minute. He set his fork down, pushed back his chair, and stood up. "I'm going outside for a bit." Clara watched him as he walked out of the dining room, her eyes full of thought. She knew that David had been haunted by the story more than he let on. Something about that boy had touched something David wasn't ready to face. But the more important question was, how would it change him? David lay in bed, his eyes wide open, staring at the dark ceiling. The bedside clock flashed 2:47 a.m., but he couldn't sleep. He had experienced sleepless nights before, driven by work, crucial deals, or million-dollar negotiations. But never had he felt so haunted by something as simple as this: a boy refusing money. "Lucas," the boy's calm face kept appearing in his mind, along with his firm words, "I don't need money. I just want to help." Each time he replayed it, David felt an odd sense of discomfort. Part of him couldn't accept it. No one does something without a reason. No one helps others without expecting something in return. But Lucas didn't hesitate to turn down his money, and that very fact had left him more confused than ever. He turned over, but sleep wouldn't come. Clara was still sound asleep beside him, her breathing steady, but he couldn't find peace. He tried to push the thought aside, tried to convince himself that this was just a trivial matter, but it clung to him, weighing on his mind like an unsolved puzzle. Finally, as the clock neared 5 a.m., he couldn't take it any longer. He sat up, gently swung his legs off the bed, careful not to wake Clara. He slipped on a light jacket, walked out onto the balcony, and took a deep breath in the chilly morning air. The city was still in darkness, with only a few yellow street lights casting a faint glow, but his mind was racing with thoughts of that boy. And then an idea came to him. He had to go back and find Lucas. David couldn't explain why he felt compelled to do this. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was a blow to his pride that a 14-year-old boy had confused him more than any business rival ever could. Or perhaps deep down, a part of him was hoping to uncover something he had never understood before. He went back inside, changed into more casual clothes, no longer the sharply tailored suit he usually wore. Then he walked down to the garage and climbed into his SUV. As he sat behind the wheel, he didn't start the engine immediately. He sat there, thinking about what he was about to do. This was a decision that made no logical sense. He didn't have a deal to negotiate, no benefit to gain. So why did he care so much about this? After a few seconds of hesitation, he pressed the start button. The engine roared to life, shattering the quiet of the night. He stared at the steering wheel, then took a deep breath. He needed to know. He needed to understand why a boy could do something that even adults wouldn't do. And that meant he had to go back to where he met Lucas. The SUV quietly rolled out of the estate gates, heading down the empty road that, just the day before, he never thought he would return to. David drove down the familiar road where he had stopped just the day before, the place where his tire had blown and Lucas had appeared as if summoned by fate. The morning light was still faint, the weak rays cutting through the light mist, making the dirt road look even more desolate. The surroundings were just as they had been the day before, silent, deserted, without a soul in sight. He slowed down, his eyes constantly scanning the sides of the road, hoping to spot any trace of the boy. But Lucas wasn't there. There was no sign that the boy had returned. No one else was on the road, nothing but the eerie silence that enveloped the area. David felt an indescribable sense of emptiness. Where had the boy gone? He couldn't have just disappeared without a trace. He parked the car at the side of the road, stepped out, and looked around, as though hoping that with a little more patience, Lucas would appear again. But all he could hear was the sound of birds chirping and the wind blowing across the empty fields. The feeling of disappointment crept into his chest, but he wasn't ready to give up. If the boy lived nearby, surely someone must know who he was. David got back in the car, driving slower now along the road until he spotted a small house not far from the main road. It was an old wooden house, its paint faded over time. The metal roof showed clear signs of weathering from storms. In front of the house was a crooked fence, a few old items scattered across the yard indicating that this was the home of a family not doing very well. He pulled over, got out, and walked up to the house, knocking on the door. A moment later, the wooden door creaked open, and a middle-aged woman appeared. She had short curly hair, a weathered face, but there was a softness in her expression. She looked at David with a cautious gaze, but not overly guarded. "Hello," David spoke up, feeling somewhat strange standing at the threshold of a stranger's door. "Sorry to bother you, but I'm looking for a boy around 14 years old. His name's Lucas. He helped me yesterday on this road." The woman seemed taken aback when she heard the name. She looked at David for a long time, as if weighing whether or not she should trust him. Finally, she gave a slight nod. "Lucas," she repeated, her voice low with a touch of surprise. David nodded immediately. "Yes, the boy changed my tire. I'd like to meet him again." The woman sighed softly, then opened the door just a little wider. "If you're looking for Lucas," she said, her gaze still holding something unreadable, "maybe you should come inside." David was momentarily surprised by the response, but he nodded and stepped inside. He didn't know what he was about to uncover, but his instincts told him this wasn't going to be just a normal encounter anymore. David stepped into the small house. The interior was modest but tidy. The living room featured an old wooden sofa set, a few faded decorations showing signs of time, and an old TV sitting in the corner. There was nothing extravagant or modern, but everything was neatly arranged, radiating the warmth of a real family home. The woman, Lucas's mother, stood across from him, her arms crossed over her chest. She appeared weary, with dark circles under her eyes, as if she had endured many sleepless nights. Yet her face remained kind. However, her eyes still held a certain caution. A stranger in expensive clothes driving a luxury SUV to find her son surely wasn't an everyday occurrence. "You say Lucas helped you?" she asked, her voice still tinged with hesitation. David nodded. "Yes. Yesterday my tire blew out on the road, and the boy appeared and changed the tire for me. I tried to pay him, but he refused." The woman studied David intently, as if evaluating whether his words were truthful. Finally, she sighed, her voice softening a little. "That's just how he is," she said quietly. "The boy never accepts money for helping anyone." David furrowed his brow. A 14-year-old boy from a family that wasn't well off, refusing money when given the chance. It didn't make sense. "So why?" he blurted out. Lucas's mother shrugged, but there was a trace of tenderness in her eyes. "I've always taught him that helping others doesn't always need a reward. If you can do something good, do it because you want to, not because you expect something in return." David fell silent. Those words struck at the very core of beliefs he had held throughout his entire life. The woman glanced at him again, this time with a slight lessening of the weariness in her gaze. "If you've just come to thank him, I'll call him out," she said, then turned toward the hallway. "Lucas, someone's here to see you." David stood still, his heart slowing for a moment as he heard footsteps approaching. And when Lucas appeared, his eyes widened in surprise upon recognizing David. But it wasn't anxiety or fear, it was genuine surprise. He didn't expect the man from yesterday to come back looking for him. David stared at Lucas, and for the first time in many years, he didn't know how to begin. It wasn't just about thanking him anymore. He needed to understand. David stepped into the small house, and immediately he could feel the difference. The kitchen, old yet neat, had wooden chairs worn from time, a dining table with small cracks, but on it, simple dishes were laid out. A few slices of bread, fried eggs, a jug of milk, and a pot of fresh coffee that gave off a pleasant aroma. Lucas quickly pulled out a chair for David to sit. Then without hesitation, poured him a cup of coffee as if they had known each other for years. David took the cup of coffee, but he felt a strange sensation. Everything here was so different from his world. He thought about his lavish mansion, a large kitchen filled with modern appliances, a sleek, polished dining table, meals prepared by his private chef. But in that space, there was rarely any warmth. The meals at his house were often quiet moments where each family member was absorbed in their phone or their own business. No one truly connected with one another. But here, even though there were only 3 of them, the kitchen was filled with warmth he hadn't felt before. Lucas sat across from him, picked up a piece of toasted bread, took a bite, and casually spoke as he chewed. "You didn't have time to change the tire yesterday, right?" David paused for a moment before chuckling lightly. "Not that I didn't have time. I've just never had to do it myself." Lucas raised an eyebrow, looking surprised. "Never." David shook his head. "There's always someone else to do it for me. I just make a phone call, and it's taken care of." Lucas shrugged, but there was no admiration or surprise in his expression. He simply said, "I guess you live really differently from us." David didn't know how to respond. The boy didn't envy his life, nor did he admire it. He just accepted it as a fact, nothing more, nothing less. Lucas's mother smiled and placed a portion of fried eggs on David's plate. "Help yourself. I know you could have more extravagant breakfasts, but this is all we have." David looked down at the simple meal in front of him. It wasn't a fancy dish like those at a restaurant, but it had the taste of sincerity. He picked up his fork, took a bite of the fried eggs, and realized this was one of the best breakfasts he'd ever had. Not because the food was extraordinary, but because for the first time in years, he truly felt the meaning of a family meal. Lucas continued chatting carefree. He talked about school, about fixing things around the house with his mother, and how his father had taught him to do hands-on work so that he would never have to depend on anyone else. His sincerity and ease made David feel like he had never really understood life in this way. He didn't realize how quickly time passed. This was the longest breakfast he'd ever had. No work emails interrupting, no urgent calls, no coldness in the silence of the meals in his grand mansion. Just a 14-year-old boy, a tired but loving mother, and a simple breakfast that made him realize that perhaps he had missed so many important things in his life. For the first time, David asked himself, between him and Lucas, who was the truly wealthy one? David sat there, looking around the small house with a thoughtful gaze. The walls were old, paint chipped in places, and the ceiling showed signs of water stains from past leaks. The wooden floor creaked slightly with every movement. In the corner of the room stood an old gas stove, giving off a faint warmth but clearly showing signs of many years of use. Everything in this house seemed to speak of modesty, but there was a warmth, a sense of family that filled the space. David placed his coffee cup down and watched Lucas, who was casually taking a bite of bread. The boy didn't seem self-conscious or sad about his circumstances. He didn't complain, didn't compare himself to others. He simply lived with what he had, and that was what left David more perplexed than ever. He had met countless people in his life, some rich, but always feeling like something was missing, always wanting more. But this boy, despite living in a humble home, could comfortably invite a stranger into his home for a meal without hesitation. He stirred his spoon in the cup, then looked directly at Lucas's mother, who had been quietly sitting across from him all this time. "I can help you fix up the house," he said, his tone calm but sincere. She blinked, as if not believing what she had just heard. "What did you say?" David nodded. "This house, it's clearly been around for many years. I can help replace the roof, fix the plumbing, even build an extra room for Lucas. The boy is a good one, and I want to help." Lucas's mother stayed silent for a long moment. Then she shook her head, her gaze firm but not offended. "We don't accept charity." David was taken aback by her response. He didn't expect such an immediate rejection of his offer. All his life, he had been used to solving problems with money. When his staff needed better working conditions, he provided new equipment. When partners faced challenges, he invested or created opportunities for cooperation. For him, any issue could be solved if you had the financial resources. But here, at this moment, he realized that there were things money couldn't buy, and that was the dignity and self-respect of a person. The room fell silent after her words. David leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixated on the old wooden table in front of him. The surface was marked with small scratches, faint cracks that he guessed were from years of family meals and the passage of time. In his world, tables and chairs were always pristine, flawless, replaced when signs of wear appeared. But here, these old things carried a story, a past that its owners had no desire to erase or replace with money. "Why did you refuse?" David spoke, for the first time in many years feeling the need to understand something that had nothing to do with business interests. Lucas's mother set her coffee cup down, her hands slightly clenched as if trying to stay calm during a conversation she had anticipated. "I know you're a good man," she said slowly, "and I don't doubt your sincerity. But I raised Lucas with one clear principle. No one owes us anything, and we don't want to owe anyone anything." David fell silent. That was a direct answer, but it left him feeling a lump in his chest. He looked at Lucas, who was still calmly eating, showing no surprise or disappointment at his mother's answer. The boy understood completely why he couldn't accept help. "But this house really needs repairs," David continued, his voice softer, almost pleading. "I'm not doing this out of pity. I just want to help." Lucas's mother smiled faintly, but it wasn't a smile of concession. It was the smile of someone who had heard offers like this before. "I know," she said gently, "but I've raised Lucas on my own since he was very young. I've done everything to keep this family going. If we accept your help, then what happens the next time we face difficulty? Will we expect someone else to come help again?" David was shaken by her words because that was exactly how he had lived his entire life. He had always believed he could make a phone call to solve problems. When he needed something, he had a team of assistants and employees at his disposal. If something needed fixing, he could hire someone immediately. He had never faced hardship himself. But Lucas and his mother were different. They had learned to stand on their own, without relying on anyone, even if that meant living in an old house and doing everything with their own hands. David took a deep breath. He had never thought that helping someone could be so difficult. Lucas then spoke, his voice calm but firm. "You know," he said, putting down his bread, "I don't hate rich people. I don't think they're evil or selfish. But what a lot of people don't understand is that kindness shouldn't be given in a way that makes others feel small." David turned to look at the boy, surprised by how maturely he expressed this, far beyond his years. Lucas continued, "If someone helps me do something that I can do myself, then what do I do the next time something like this happens? Should I rely on someone else? And if one day no one comes to help, what then? No one can help me forever." David didn't know what to say anymore. This 14-year-old boy was teaching him a lesson that he had never realized in all his decades of life. Kindness, if given in the wrong way, can make the recipient feel small, weak. But true kindness is helping someone in a way that makes them stronger, not making them dependent on the help. Lucas's mother looked at David, seeing the silence in his eyes. Then she spoke softly again. "We don't need a new house, David. We just need a life that we can build with our own hands." David looked at her, then at Lucas, and for the first time in his life, he felt truly small in the face of something greater than money. He thought about his grand mansion, a place that always had everything perfect, but never the warmth that this small house had. He thought about the lavish, cold dinners where everyone was busy with their phones, their work, no one really talking to each other. And then he looked at this simple breakfast, bread, fried eggs, coffee, but filled with love and connection. Perhaps for the first time in his life, he was beginning to understand that true wealth is not in what we own, but in how we appreciate what we have. David didn't say anything more. He picked up his coffee cup, took a sip, and nodded slowly. "All right," he said softly. "I understand." But deep inside, he knew that he wasn't ready to stop here, and somehow, he would find another way to help, one that truly mattered. David left the small house, but his mind was still unsettled. The words of Lucas's mother and the boy himself echoed in his head. Kindness shouldn't make others feel small. Kindness isn't about doing for someone. It's about helping them become stronger. He drove slowly along the empty road, for the first time in his life feeling confused by his own good intentions. He wanted to help them, but how could he do so without making them feel pitied? How could his assistants not take away the dignity they had worked so hard to maintain? Then an idea came to him. If they didn't want help as a gift, then he would make it an opportunity. The next morning, David returned. When he stepped up to the porch, Lucas was sitting, working on an old bicycle. The boy looked up, surprised but not avoiding his gaze. "You're back?" Lucas asked, his tone calm as if he had expected this. David nodded. I have an idea. Lucas tilted his head, curious. What idea? David took a deep breath, then spoke slowly. I'm going to help fix your house, but not by hiring someone to come do it and handing over the keys. I want you to be part of it. You'll work with them, learn from them, and if you want, you can use the skills you gain to fix things on your own or help others. No one will do it for you. You'll be part of the process. Lucas's eyes widened. Then he turned to look at his mother. She stood by the door, arms crossed, her expression still guarded, but this time she didn't refuse outright. David continued, looking into her eyes. I know you don't want charity, and I respect that. But this isn't charity. This is an opportunity for Lucas to learn, to improve his home himself. I don't want to take away his or your dignity. I just want to do something we can all be proud of. A long silence followed. Lucas looked at his mother, then at David, then down at the old bike he was repairing. After a moment, he gave a small smile, one that showed agreement. So, if I help, you won't do everything for me, right? David chuckled softly. Exactly. Lucas's mother sighed, but this time it wasn't a weary sigh. It was a sigh of acceptance. She nodded slowly. All right. If you say so, then I have no reason to object. Lucas smiled for real. So do we start? David laughed. Right now. That very afternoon, David got to work. He didn't just hire workers to fix the house. He asked them to teach Lucas. The workers, those who typically did their job and left, began to view the boy with a certain respect when they saw him attentively watching and learning each technique. Lucas didn't just stand by and watch them work. He rolled up his sleeves, listened to every instruction, and tried every task himself. He learned how to hold a hammer properly, how to measure, to cut wood, how to mix cement to patch up cracks in the walls. At first, the workers were skeptical about working with a 14-year-old, but after a few days, they were impressed by Lucas's perseverance and eagerness to learn. It wasn't just Lucas. The community around them began to take notice of the change. Neighbors who had once only observed Lucas's family from a distance now started to appear more often. Mr. Brown, a plumber who lived nearby, volunteered to check the plumbing for free. Mrs. Janice, a retired teacher, brought over a few old cans of paint she had left over from a house renovation last year. Other neighbors, even without any specialized skills, stopped by to lend a hand, cleaning up, moving things, or simply bringing over fresh loaves of bread so everyone could take a break during the work. Lucas's small house, once a quiet, lonely structure in the neighborhood, had now become a hub of connection, a symbol of help given the right way. Lucas was no longer just an anonymous boy. He was learning, growing, and becoming a part of this transformation. And David, who once thought that writing a check could change someone's life, was now witnessing something entirely new. True kindness isn't about handing out a gift. It's about creating an opportunity for someone to rise on their own. And for the first time, David felt that he wasn't just helping Lucas. Lucas was teaching him something he had never realized in his entire life. After weeks of hard work, Lucas's house was finally completed. The walls that once had cracks and stains were now freshly painted, looking brighter and more solid than ever. The old roof that leaked every time it rained had been replaced with a strong metal one, eliminating any risk of leaks. The floor had been relayed, no longer filled with gaps that allowed the cold wind to rush in on chilly nights. The small kitchen where Lucas's mother had always prepared simple meals now had a new gas stove, a sturdy sink, and a plumbing system free from rust. Lucas stood before his house, his eyes wide in disbelief, unable to speak. He took slow steps, his hand gently touching the newly painted wall, as if he were touching something unreal. His mother stood beside him, tears quietly streaming down her face. She never imagined that just a few weeks later, their old house could be transformed this way. It wasn't luxurious, it wasn't extravagant, but it was a true home, a place that was no longer a burden but a safe haven. David stood back, arms crossed, observing the reactions of the mother and son. He had never felt a sense of accomplishment so meaningful. Throughout his career, he had invested millions in large projects, built magnificent structures, but never had a moment made him feel as fulfilled as this one. Lucas turned to David, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know what to say. David smiled gently, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. You don't need to say anything. This is your home. You've worked hard for it. Lucas bit his lip, but the joy in his eyes was unmistakable. The boy didn't feel like he had received charity. He felt that he had contributed to its creation, and that, to him, meant more than anything else. After everyone had finished celebrating, David clapped his hands, drawing the attention of the crowd. "Everyone," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "Today is not just the day this house is finished. Today is the day we witness an amazing boy, a person with a sincere heart and extraordinary determination." Lucas blushed, lowering his head slightly at the praise. David continued, "I've learned so much from Lucas. And I believe that if someone like this boy can do such wonderful things, even now, he deserves a future full of possibilities." At this point, he pulled out a folder from his pocket and handed it to Lucas's mother. She frowned as she opened it, and immediately her eyes widened in shock. "What is this?" she asked, her voice trembling. David smiled. "This is a scholarship fund for Lucas." A heavy silence fell over the room. Lucas blinked rapidly, unable to believe his ears. "A scholarship? What do you mean?" David nodded. "I don't just want to help you get a better house. I want to make sure you have the best opportunity to grow, to pursue your dreams. This scholarship will help you attend any school you want, whether it's high school, college, or even beyond." Lucas stood frozen, his mind racing. "But I didn't expect this. You didn't have to do this." David looked directly into his eyes, his voice gentle but firm. "Do good things for others, just as you did for me." Lucas stared at David, his hands trembling as he clutched the folder. In that moment, the boy understood that every small thing he did could create unexpected changes. And today, his kindness had brought about a future that he had never dared to dream of. Lucas's mother broke into tears, unable to speak. Lucas still stood there, unable to believe that something as small as helping a stranger change a tire could lead to this moment. David smiled softly, looking at the boy with pride. "You deserve this, Lucas. I believe in you." And that was the moment the boy understood that sometimes kindness is not just an action. It can be the beginning of a chain of miracles that you could never have predicted. David drove back home, but for the first time in his life, he didn't feel the pride he usually felt when the large gates opened before him. The magnificent mansion, with its pristine white walls and gleaming glass windows reflecting the street lights, suddenly felt eerily empty. In the past, every time he walked through this door, he felt power, control, and a sense of pride that he had achieved everything others dreamed of. But now, comparing it to Lucas's small but warm home, it was nothing more than a lavish concrete structure. He parked the car, turned off the engine, but didn't rush to get out. Something inside him had changed. He was no longer the David he used to be, the successful but cold man who believed that everything in life had a price. He had once thought that money could solve everything, that helping someone simply meant pulling out a check and signing it. But now he understood that true kindness isn't something you can buy. True kindness comes from sincerity, from a genuine desire to help others without expecting anything in return. He sat there for a long time until a familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. "You're home." David looked up and saw Clara standing by the door. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite explain, both warm and probing, as though she were trying to read his thoughts. He nodded and got out of the car, walking toward her. As he stepped through the door, a feeling of strangeness immediately overwhelmed him. This was his house, but it no longer felt like his home. Clara watched him closely as he sank onto the sofa, rubbing his temples as if trying to organize his thoughts. "What's wrong?" David looked up, staring at her for a long moment before responding. "I don't know," he sighed, "but it feels something's not right." Clara walked over and sat down next to him. "What's not right?" David sat in silence for a moment. He thought back to the breakfast in Lucas's small kitchen, simple but warm. He remembered how Lucas and his mother spoke to each other, with no distance, no coldness between them. He remembered the sound of the boy laughing as he learned how to hold a hammer, how he eagerly nailed a piece of wood onto the roof of his own home. And then he looked back at this place, this grand mansion where he and Clara lived like strangers under the same roof. "I think," he spoke slowly, "I found the most important thing in my life." Clara tilted her head, her eyes shining with understanding. "Oh, what's that?" she asked gently. David looked deep into his wife's eyes. "Wealth isn't in what we own," he said, each word seeming to etch itself into his mind. "It's in the connections we make with others." Clara smiled, a gentle smile filled with emotion. Finally, you understand. David nodded. I used to think I had everything, but it turns out I've never really had anything. He looked around at his luxurious home. Because these things, they can't bring real happiness. Clara placed her hand on his, giving it a gentle squeeze. So what are you going to do now? David looked down at her hand, then slowly took it in his. He didn't have a clear answer yet, but for the first time in his life, he knew that he wanted to do something that truly mattered, not for fame, not for profit, but simply because he wanted to. He was no longer the David of before. He was a new person. Many years later, a new path had opened. Lucas had now grown into a man. He was no longer the 14-year-old boy with worn-out shoes and a faded shirt. He had faced challenges, overcome the barriers that fate had placed before him, and now he had become someone he never dreamed of being. Standing before the large stage at a youth seminar for young people eager to rise, Lucas took a deep breath. Below him, hundreds of people waited to hear him speak. Young people who might be standing right where he once stood, full of ambition yet filled with doubt about the future. He took the microphone, flashing a warm smile. Everything began on what seemed like the most ordinary day. Lucas began, his voice steady but full of power. A day I never thought would change my life. He paused, his gaze drifting to a memory that had etched itself deeply into his heart. He remembered that afternoon, the empty road, the SUV parked by the roadside, and a stranger standing helplessly by a flat tire. A silence fell over the auditorium. The boy all those years ago had simply helped someone in need, not expecting anything in return. But little did he know that kindness had created a chain reaction, leading him to this day. Just one small act, Lucas continued. But sometimes it's those small acts that open doors we never imagined. Whispers ran through the crowd. People began to sense something deeper than just an ordinary motivational story. Lucas glanced down at the front row, where an older man sat silently watching him. It was David. His hair had grayed, but his eyes were still sharp, filled with pride. The man who once believed money could buy everything now understood that kindness was the greatest asset. And Lucas knew, without this man, without that moment, there would be no Lucas standing here today. A few days later, Lucas returned to his old home. The house still stood, but it was no longer the rickety structure it once was. Now it was a warm, solid place, stronger than ever before. He walked slowly along the familiar road, letting the memories flood back. He remembered the difficult days he and his mother lived through, but never losing hope. He remembered the time spent repairing the house, learning how to hold a hammer, how to mix cement, and above all, learning that people can change each other's lives in ways no one expects. He stood before the porch, looking at his hands. These hands had once changed a flat tire. Back then, he hadn't thought much about it. He simply wanted to help a stranger. But now he understood that every action, no matter how small, can create a ripple effect. Lucas raised his head, his eyes resolute. Kindness is a cycle. He had helped one person, and that person had helped him change his entire life. Now it was time for him to do the same for others. With a soft smile, he took a step forward, because this journey, the journey of kindness, would never end. Has this story touched your heart? If you believe that a small act of kindness can change someone's life, if you feel the power of compassion and the importance of genuine human connections, then don't hesitate. Hit the subscribe button now. Every story we share carries a powerful message, a meaningful lesson, and we are here to bring you the most inspiring and life-changing narratives. Let's spread kindness together. Let's make the world a better place, one story at a time. Subscribe now and be part of the movement that makes a difference.